diabetes affecting these organs, and how is the continuum relevant to our practice? How can we stop this continuum? And what is Rybelsus, the oral semaglutide, where it can help us to impede, halt, and stop this process? So over to you.
Yeah. Am I audible? So good evening to all, and first of all I must thank the physician India for making this evening possible, and thanks to Dr. Monasil for being here. From State College, so I think support him as much as we can. That's my duty as a senior. So if you look at the common soil for cardiac, kidney and vascular disease, that is diabetes. So diabetes we not, if you look at the, so I always tell patients that the mother of all diseases is diabetes. So if you have diabetes, you have to look for other organ damage. And the new term, which is not still has come in the textbook, but is in the realm of journals and in our discussions, is CKM syndrome. So you must have heard about metabolic syndrome, the acute cardiac syndrome, and so when we talk about syndrome, we are talking about a combination of multiple components of that syndrome. So this is the syndrome which will delve in detail in subsequent slides. Is that the CKM syndrome is something which is the new buzzword as far as the metabolic and vascular disease is concerned. The pathophysiological conjunction of CKM is something where the common soil is diabetes. So if you look at the diabetes, cardiovascular disease accounts for around half of deaths of type 2 diabetes. And if you look at the acute heart attack or acute myocardial infarction, 62% of the patients with diabetes, they don't die of anything else, but they die because of the acute cardiovascular complications. So atherosclerosis is the formation of fibropathic lesion in arterial wall, and this is the most common cardiovascular disease. So it can cause, if it happens in heart arteries, it can cause myocardial infarction. If it happens in brain arteries, it would cause stroke. And if it is happening in the leg arteries, it will cause peripheral arterial disease. So all of them are, so in fact, one detection of one disease or one manifestation, like if somebody has got claudication, then we must see or look for coronary disease. If somebody had a stroke, we also should look for the, so they are a continuum of same pathophysiology. And if you look at the epidemiological data, how humongous this problem is, nearly 1 in 3 people with type 2 diabetes have cardiovascular disease. Of those with established cardiovascular disease, now 9 of the 10 have got atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So you can imagine how big the problem is. So if you are a diabetic, you need to be really watchful with your numbers right. You need other risk factors, and the diabetes control should be of paramount importance. So atherosclerosis is built up of plaque in arterial walls leading to arterial blood flow obstruction. So this is something where, so a lot of people would come and ask me that, why did it happen to me? So if you look at the total in philosophical way of looking at atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, this is a disease given by the Almighty to all of us, that we don't live beyond 100 years. So it is part of the aging is a major risk factor. So if we go beyond the age of 75, 80 years, then this is something where the sudden complications like either stroke or heart attack would take our lives. But if it is happening at a younger age, and which is the reality and problem in our country, where young people are having sudden death, a lot of CEOs and people who have worked in different startups, they are suddenly dropping dead because of acute myocardial infarction. So it means that the people who are having this disease in younger age group, that is lifestyle disorder. So what is lifestyle disorder? So one of them is that lifestyle disorder would lead to diabetes, and the increased cholesterol level. So this is the fatty streak. So this cannot be picked by the conventional angiogram. Then there is an atheroma, so this can be picked by CT coronary angiography. And then vulnerable plaque, which we pick it by intravascular imaging, either IVUS or oblique coherence tomography, we call it OCT. And when there is a plaque rupture, thrombus formation goes there, and then the acute ischemic event. It could be acute myocardial infarction, non-acute myocardial infarction, or just the unstable angina. So this is the continuum of the plaque, and we need to really decrease it. And how would we decrease it? We'll come back to that. So there is an inflammatory process which will rupture this plaque. So you'll be surprised to know that people who have had inflammatory process, either even a simple influenza which we pass off like it's just a common cold, cough and cold, but that increases the risk of acute myocardial infarction or acute coronary syndrome by 40%. So that's a huge jump. And then a lot of people who would have, even pneumonia, or patients who would have, we have seen during the COVID era that patients who have, as young as my team has done primary PCIs in people who are 18 or 20 years of age during COVID, because the inflammatory process led to plaque formation. So this is why the oxidized LDL and cholesterol deposition in the vessel wall leads to an increase in inflammatory biomarkers such as interleukin 6. So we have been doing IL-6, we have been doing tests like D-dimer and all. So we need to look at this, and now the C-reactive protein, so highly sensitive C-reactive protein, or even the HS-tropine is something which is very important that can predict that the XY patient is going to have a cardiac event. So these inflammatory markers, if they are high, they can cause the even plaque which are 10-20% in luminal diameter, which will not ever cause angina, but that can cause acute myocardial infarction. And you'll be surprised to know that 60% of the myocardial infarctions are caused by plaque rupture, which are luminal diameter is less than 50%. So the combination of dyslipidemia and the other cardiovascular, conventional cardiovascular risk factors like diabetes, high blood pressure, smoking, obesity, unhealthy lifestyle, stress, chronic inflammatory disease, and also low socioeconomic status is one syndrome where all these factors would be there, because the low socioeconomic status would have more inflammatory insults to the body, and these things will lead to the secretion of all the inflammatory markers that will increase the CRP. In fact, there was one study which showed, that was done in Chennai, that people who are of low socioeconomic status, they feel that their body tolerance is higher, and there the CRP was significantly high without any provocation, without diabetes and all. Which means that they get exposed to multiple toxins because of their style, and that would lead to increased risk of vascular diseases. The oxidized LDL is something which is very, very important, because that leads to, it's like if you go in realm of what we call the gastroenterologist, where if you look at the hepatologist term, if somebody has got hepatitis C alone, that is not so harmful, but if they have got hepatitis B also, then it makes it more fulminant. So similarly, if the person has got high lipids plus combined with the high inflammatory markers, the inflammation is high, then it can cause plaque rupture. So there are two things. One is cardiovascular and cardiometabolic, which we need to really focus on, and these are the terms which have come in recent past about the cardiovascular is like any artery, whether it is the coronary artery or the peripheral vascular artery or even the brain artery. So this is something which is a vasculopathy, vascular sclerosis, arterial sclerosis, and arterial hypertension. So the combination of the risk factors would lead to plaque rupture and would cause heart attack in patients who are having even 20% or 30% plaque formation. And cardiometabolic is something which is, I think Dr. Sahu will elaborate much on that, but this is again insulin resistant, impaired glucose tolerance, dyslipidemia, hypertension, adiposity, overweight. So these all things are something which will continue to this. So this is the concept, we call it cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome. So which is a new thing which has been found, that we call it adipocitopathy. This is something where the fats would decrease, secrete a lot of toxins, leptins and also. So metabolic risk factor is something that includes those patients at risk of cardiovascular disease due to metabolic risk factors or CKD or with existing cardiovascular disease. So if you look at the patients who are obese, who are diabetic, there will be some kidney involvement, insulin resistance, and this continuum would lead to what we call multi-organ dysfunction, and they work in tandem. So there is a synergistic negative impact on the vascular system, and that would affect the kidney also and the heart also. So of late we have been seeing a lot of the combination of what we call cardiorenal syndrome, cardiometabolic syndrome, and cardio kidney metabolic syndrome. So these are the things which have really found that we need to look at the cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome in particular, because that is a common soil is diabetes. So if you look at the CKM syndrome, they have been classified as stage 4. So stage 0 is something where there is no CKM, but the patient would have risk factors like glucose levels would go high, blood pressure has to be looked at, the lipid levels would be slightly high, and also the patient have a BMI. So waist circumference is something which is important. So why Indians are getting more cardiovascular disease? So there was a study by INAS and INAS which looked at the immigrant Indians, which does not apply to Dr. Sharma, who is from Melbourne, because his waist circumference is absolutely acceptable. So he's lean and fit. But it has been seen that people who have migrated to Western world, and if their waist circumference is high, then they are at a significantly higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So stage 1 is where there is an excess or dysfunctional adipose tissue, and you can see this is the abdominal obesity. So abdominal obesity is something which is strongly related to the adverse cardiovascular outcome. The stage 2 is metabolic risk factor and chronic kidney disease. So we need to identify them at very young age. The hypertension, hypertriglyceridemia. So remember, a lot of people would pass it off that your LDL is okay, don't worry. But increased triglycerides, again, if you look at, and a lot of people here in the group are practicing that as a diabetologist, and Dr. Saha will elaborate it further, that hypertriglyceridemia in Indian, or I would say Indian subcontinent, so people who are from, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, there it has been found to be a very strong risk factor, because genetically our LDL is not so high, so triglyceride is something very important, and I hope you relate. Metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and moderate to high risk of CKD. So if you look at the people who are at a risk of chronic kidney disease is highest in India, because we have got highest population of diabetes. And then stage 3 is people who are subclinical cardiovascular disease, subclinical atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, heart failure, and risk equivalent to high risk of CKD. But if you go to stage 4, again it's a manifested disease, and unfortunately we deal with only stage 4 disease patients, because they will come to us only when they have got congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, peripheral vascular disease, stroke, or atrial fibrillation. So this is the control of all the end stages. So if we act at this stage, probably we will be in the war, not this. And adipocitopathy, that is the toxicity of the fat. This is very, very important. It is a key driver of pathophysiology of CKM. So what it does, if you are obese, it will lead to lipid and glucose accumulation. So what we call glucose lipotoxicity, beta cell exhaustion would be there, cytokine release would be there. So there will be inflammation, promotes lipolysis, increasing fatty acid flux to the liver, enhancing glucogenesis, and worsening the glucose lipotoxicity, hyperglycemia, and beta cell function. So what it does is that it's a vicious cycle. It will lead to uncontrolled diabetes and the complication of that. So again, if you look at the inflammation, oxidative stress, insulin resistance, vascular dysfunction, this is something which is very, very important, because all these pathophysiological factors would lead to adverse cardiovascular event. So targeting the weight loss addresses metabolic risk factor of chronic, CKD, that is the CKM syndrome. So we need to control the blood pressure, we need to decrease the blood lipids, we need to decrease the blood glucose, insulin resistance will go down, and that will go down only when we counter the blood, weight. So if you decrease your weight, so what is called the BMI has to be normal. And then, of course, the inflammatory markers. So the minimum threshold of 5 to 10% weight loss is required to have a positive impact on the glycemia, blood pressure, lipid, and weight loss. More than 15% may help to mitigate other CKM complications. So as we are talking, when I was coming back for this CKM, I got a pop-up on my mobile. That was the US FDA just a minute back. Approved that the Ozempic, which is the GLP-1 receptor analog, has been approved for primarily as an indication for CKM syndrome. So chronic kidney disease, because there was a 26% risk reduction in this CKM syndrome when we use GLP-1 receptor analog. So management of CKM syndrome is that you need to, control the excess weight, you need to control your blood sugar, you need to control the metabolic dyslipidemia, the blood pressure and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease should be controlled, the lipids should be controlled, and kidney dysfunction should be controlled. So standalone kidney dysfunction, it has gotten approval for controlling the that also. So it's marketed in the name of Ozempic in Western world. So that has got, and no wonder we have got. If you look at the international guidelines, whether it is EASD, ESC, American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association, PCT, American Diabetes Association, all of them have recommended that, so we have oversung the song about SGLT2 inhibitor, but when you look at the reality, the GLP-1 receptor analog would be clear winner. So role of GLP-1 receptor analog, that is oral semaglutide, and which Dr. Chauhan elucidated that in India it is marketed as Rybelsus, which is going to be a game changer. The only thing is that we need to have a bigger pocket to buy. So if you look at the GLP-1 receptor analog, are well established and evidence for efficacy and safety in managing the type 2 diabetes, but it goes beyond managing the type 2 diabetes. So there is an effective reduction in HbA1c level, body weight reduction. So I have got a lot of doctor colleagues whom I have advised, and they have lost whopping 15 to 25 kilograms of body weight, and they are really enjoying it. So much so that now we say that there are a lot of people. There is a term in medical literature, it's called Ozempic faces. Means they have lost so much of face that they need to reload their face on Instagram to recognize them, because they have the apps of Facebook would recognize the face that you were in this group. In this group, your photo was shared, and you were tagged in some of the events. So Ozempic faces have come where. Good news is that it selectively takes more of your fat out of your body. So that's something which is, as we said, that the fat is a toxin, so we should not accumulate fat. So what it does is that there is a proven efficacy of GLP-1 receptor analog. There is a low risk of hypoglycemia, cardiovascular benefit. So we say that there are certain drugs which I think Dr. Sahu would elucidate. We call it automatic drugs. So they don't induce significant hypoglycemia, but they give the metabolic benefit. If you look at the benefits of GLP-1 receptor analogs, that extends beyond the glucose control and addresses the multiple components of CKM, and that is what we are more interested in, that controlling, because we can control the sugar with many other agents. But these collateral benefits are not there, so the GI tract benefits, the brain benefits, because the appetite and all would go. Today I had a doctor who came, he was 164 kilograms, and he said, is there any side effect of this Rybelsus? I said, it will cause the loss of appetite. He said, that is what I want. I want something which can, stop my craving. And obviously, this is something which is going to work on. Then heart and vessel effects are exemplary. There is the liver effect, pancreas and kidney. So all of them are really quite positive effects, and I think this is something which is a molecule to be looked for, and this would control the metabolic syndrome, the CKM in a greater efficacy and safety. So this is something where there is no significant adverse effect. In fact, what you want, you get it immediately with this molecule. And so cardiovascular effect of underlying molecular mechanism of action of GLP-1 receptor analog is in cardiovascular outcome trials. Animal model in cultural cell have already shown that not only it decreases your blood sugar and the cardiovascular benefit, but also the inflammation goes down. And I say that the inflammation is the basic crux of acute coronary event. So that is something which will go down. So semaglutide has something which is really revolutionized. So there is an effective reduction of HbA1c, body weight and cardiovascular risk factors. And you hardly see a molecule which will have all the three effects in one pill, that is HbA1c reduction, body weight reduction and cardiovascular risk factor. So this is something which is first and only GLP-1 receptor analog semaglutide, providing superior HbA1c reduction versus empagliflozin and sitagliptin, which was, I'm not a big fan of sitagliptin, and more than 80% of the patients reported good or very good treatment satisfaction with oral semaglutide. So I think this is a molecule to go for that. And if you look at the significant HbA1c reduction, weight reduction, so it is something, when we look at the pioneer trials, this is something which has really shown that it is not only safe, efficacious, but also but you should not expect an overnight results. You need to really take it for 6 odd months at least to see so if you look at the semaglutide and the effect on cardiovascular outcomes in people with diabetes, there is improved glucose metabolism, it reduces the body weight, it reduces the MACE rates, reduces the inflammation, which is the mother of all acute events, improves the lipid profile and blood pressure, and shown to have anti-sclerotic properties, and also shown to have renal effects. So that is a molecule which is ideal for CKM syndrome. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will request Dr. Chauhan to answer all your questions. I'll be going to address manifested CKM in another hall.
Just one question from Dr. Tulsi. That's the only question you have to answer.
I'll be very quick. So, again, a wonderful talk. Just one question regarding the SELECT trial. This trial was on non-diabetic patients, and at least quarter of the patients were heart failure patients. So Lancet recently said probably GLP-1 agonists not to be given in patients who have reduced ejection fraction, but wonderful drug to use in patients who have preserved ejection fraction. Just after that.
Yeah, so if you look at the heart failure data, that is why I was talking about the FDA approval about Ozempic. This has really shown that there is a very good benefit to patients who have got heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, especially patients who have had, who are on obese side, and also those patients who are on slightly on obese side have got associated cardiovascular disease. So if you remember the ESC guideline there, it is a much preferred drug than SGLT2 inhibitor if you have got an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease.
With preserved ejection fraction.
Not only preserved, but atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease standalone is an indication for GLP-1.
Would you like to give SGLT2 inhibitors in patients who have reduced ejection fraction as compared to the GLP-1 agonists?
So that is why we are talking about pillars, and probably so we have now 4 pillars. 5th pillar is in making, and this would be the 6th pillar.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, we would allow you to go. Thank you very much for making it. You are left on parole, sir. You may leave on parole. Thank you very much, sir. You make us proud always. My mountain duty is to welcome my second speaker for today evening, Dr. Monasis Sahu, who will be speaking on personalizing therapy for type 2 diabetes. You would have seen the recommendations from ADA, EASD year after year. More and more focus is being given to weight management. And unless and until you focus on both weight management and you are able to decrease the weight of a diabetic patient, you are only doing 10% of the job. Dr. Monasis Sahu will elaborate upon personalizing the therapy for our patients so that we can achieve our goals in the long term. Dr. Viveka sir elucidated on the CKM, and weight is a very important part and parcel of that. Over to Dr. Monasis Sahu. He has 25 minutes to finish and we have 20 minutes. Dr. Monasis Sahu has to leave by 10 o'clock. So please I request you to note down your questions and not many questions. And he says that I am prepared to answer those questions online. He has a drug trial meeting tomorrow morning and therefore we need to let him go. Yes. So please, Dr. Monasis Sahu, over to you. Let's hear it for Dr. Monasis Sahu. Yeah, be louder.
Yes, sir.
तेज थोड़ा सा रखना होगा आपको, थोड़ा फास्ट उसको वॉल्यूम बढ़ाओ यार, या तो वॉल्यूम बढ़ा या हैंड माइक.
Okay, so I take the slides on also. I'll use the slide.
Yeah, this is
The slide that is in front of me is thank you.
भाई इतना बड़ा फेस आ गया. संजय का भी
After having talked about, discussed about this CKM syndrome,
Yeah, this is the full.
So, since I've been interested with the responsibility through three specific cases, and with the limitation of time, what I'll be focusing on one and quickly touching to the next two slides. You can skip this my own. Alright, so Anil came and Anil disappeared. So just do some little bit of a case discussion. And here we talked about one prototype, and all these slides are from the medical team of Novo, and thanks to the medical division as well. For 6 years diabetes duration with a history of angina, and the treatment for diabetes being metformin 1000 mg per day with a sitagliptin 50 mg per day. As Dr. Viveka was saying that he does not like sitagliptin so much, so had he been here I would have asked that why this 50 mg per day. Generally we give a classical 100 mg per day, unless and until, in terms of fill in the blanks, unless until the eGFR is less than 40%. That is the one indication where we would typically like to give a sitagliptin on a lower dose. On telmisartan 40 mg and on statins, rosuvastatin 10 mg per day. Just come to me for a diabetes. Let's talk about that. Just imagine this come only for a kind of a quick diabetes review. As a diabetologist and an endocrinologist, in a quick, those 5 minutes of a discussion, 5 minutes of prescription writing, what are the things that go through your mind with such as a clinical detail? Let's look forward.
the BMI, and we ought to, and in this era we were talking about every therapy which can impact upon adiposopathy. Why do I use the word adiposopathy? Somewhere using the phrase like in obesity or just the weight is a bit of a negative psychology towards the prescription writing. And the current description, if some of you might have seen a bit of my own prescription, the phrase obesity is being replaced by just an ABCD. And ABCD is, like as you are aware, it is nothing but an medication, is a good nutritionist. A teamwork in terms of a good counseling related to diet, let's not forget about it. In terms of some of the older data set related to obesity management is to do with a very low calorie diet, where individuals are given just less than 800 calories. There is just given a meal replacement. Let's not forget those data with that so-called, I said that enthusiasm related to the diabetes medication and in terms of the gut hormones. Now, how do I essentially take care of A, the obesity, the diabetes, the dyslipidemia and the hypertension? Here, as per the slide, what is written is, and sometimes in terms of the slide deck, I have a unique question quite often that pick up the wrong spots out here in the slide. So here what is done is a QRIS-3 scoring in terms of trying to understand what is the QRIS scoring provide us. That is a 10 years atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk, right? Now, a QRIS has come from UK and it has included in terms of an ethnicity also Indians. So therefore the QRIS calculator is something which is promoted in terms of uses of a QRIS calculator. From a US system there's a different calculator. This is one calculator. Most of the calculators in terms of a bit of a reminder is to find out an ACVD risk. If there has been no established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, no cardiovascular event, and provided the patient is not on statins. So here in this case, even if there is a slide out here which is visible in front of you and somebody has done a QRIS, I said, okay, the person is already on statins. Why do you really need to really now quantify it? And does it really have a lot of difference whether it is a high risk versus a very high risk? Because most likely the treatment pattern does not change. However, just to be reminded that we ought to do a kind of an ACVD risk profiling for every patient for obesity, non-diabetic, diabetic, for everyone. To be reminded, the gentleman has got a BMI of 31. So how can we manage? And as we stated here, in terms of the 10 years risk is 31%, and anything which is more than 20 is a very high risk, right? How do we even manage it? Okay. In terms of the guidelines, whether we talk about ADA, ESC guidelines, everyone, there are only two therapies which we need to discuss again and again and again. And we have been bombarded with a lot of scientific literature, webinars, seminars, everything. And those two are, which has got approved in terms of good impact towards an ACVD. One is the SGLT2 inhibitors, and the second is the GLP-1 receptor agonist. Let's take a clue from the question which Dr. Tulsi actually interacted with Dr. Vivek. The bifurcation is very simple now. You've got a heart failure, have to think about SGLT2 inhibitors in a better pedestal as compared to the GLP-1 receptor agonist. I have a person which is more in terms of an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. That's where the GLP-1 receptor agonist outscores SGLT2 inhibitors, and that's from a fundamental bifurcation in terms of how we decide a therapy for every patient. So, when choosing a glucose lowering therapy is obviously any regimen with high to very high dual weight and glucose lowering options, and here comes the gut hormone. Since I see Dr. Manish here, and if I can just share one patient who recently was referred with diabetes not being controlled, and before going even for insulin, rightfully so, sir, you use a GLP-1 receptor agonist, if not using a brand name out here, the gut hormones. We sometimes need to remind ourselves that unfortunately most of the gut hormones, when we talk about the GLP-1 receptor agonist, they are branded and they are positioned only as an obesity medication, somewhere in our mind. But we should not forget the fact they are very, very powerful, very potent, and have an anti-hyperglycemic action. So much so, and that is the only reason why if you look carefully about the guidelines, majority of guidelines, Now they are acknowledging the importance of such agents and are saying that even before using an insulin, use a GLP-1 injectable GLP-1 receptor agonist. Whether you use a dulaglutide, whether you use a liraglutide, whether you use a semaglutide, whether it is tirzepatide, that's entirely your option. But then, so the idea is to actually remind and recollect the one important factor, that beyond that good advantage on the weight, they are very good agents in terms of a control of glycemia. Now, come back to the same case and think about, okay, so as we talk about atherosclerotic ASCVD risk, we talk about high risk. What do we really mean by high risk? Well, we have calculators. One by the calculator, you can just punch in all the data, whether smoker, non-smoker, premature history of coronary artery disease among the family members, and you have a risk profile. And that comes from a calculator. How many of us really use a calculator? I typically do not use a calculator in our day-to-day busy practices, as I say. That how many of us, and I have asked, even gone through a lot of cardiologists also, how many of you really use the calculators? And I found it practically, on a practical note, probably none. So therefore, let's ask the question that how do we then delineate who are the indicators of the high CVD risk? This is algorithmic related aspects of from an ADA, which has been showcased in multiple platforms. I mean, every platform of diabetes care would show this kind of a graph in the algorithmic fashion, that if there are indicators of high CVD risk, you use a GLP-1 receptor agonist with proven CVD benefit, or of course an SGLT2 inhibitor with a proven CVD benefit. The question to ask here is, what have the makers of guidelines really pinpointed? How do we really delineate who are the indicators? It's very simple. The line reads from the algorithm, if I can actually put it here, the line reads simply that although there are many definitions and many risk calculators to delineate about the high CVD risk, but broadly speaking, and this is verbatim which I am speaking on, broadly speaking, anyone where age is more than 55 years with any of the two risk factors related to either in terms of a hypertension, abdominal obesity, or in evidence of a target organ diseases such as a retinopathy, or even for that matter a microalbuminuria. So that's how we actually see that in a day-to-day clinical practice. What it begs a kind of a question and an importance is that how often do we really do this microalbumin assessment in our patients, and that's very critical to put them into that description of a high ASCVD risk or not. So what changes was done, and this is again the slide, and thanks to the medical team. I have not changed any of the slides. So if I have to ask you that, please focus on the slide and pick up what has gone wrong in the slide. So look at this, an oral semaglutide of 3 mg once daily has been added. Can anyone say that what is wrong in this entire list of prescription? So, but for a very simple logic for all of us is that, and it doesn't happen. A DPP-4 inhibitor is ongoing and along with the GLP-1 receptor agonist. Why should it never be combined? It's for a very simple logic that DPP-4 inhibitors increases the GLP-1 levels. There's no point of giving the DPP-4 inhibitor because you're injecting the GLP-1 receptor agonist, right? No other reasoning about it.
1000 once daily is also not a good thing.
Why would you say that, sir?
At least 2 grams.
Twice a day, at least twice
At
a day.
least 2
Yes.
grams.
Right. Perhaps the patient did not tolerate. Okay, so the
I
point.
didn't say.
We don't know.
Right. But having stated it, if you ask me what is my
50 is also not good.
that is correct, that's what it says. And also to say that how many times, if I have to give a metformin 1000 mg once in a day, is it correct? Yes, it is okay from a pharmacokinetics perspective. On a practical note, if it is 1000 mg also, and somebody had got an incidence of, okay, they did not tolerate 2000 mg, I know that they would not even tolerate if I give 1000 mg as once in a day of a dosing. Just divide the dose into 500 mg twice daily. So the dictum out here that I'm sharing is, if one is metformin intolerant and if one has to give 1000 mg per day, rather split the tablet to 500 mg twice daily. And you're right, sir. If somebody is intolerant, then go to here. So oral semaglutide of 3 mg once daily has been used to give a benefit of doubt also, and to provide a benefit of a fair understanding. I may also credit the gentleman who might have given the sitagliptin 50 mg per day with the semaglutide 3 mg also, though it should not be there in the prescription. And I'll tell you, and I'll tell the reason why. No. So the creatinine level was normal. So even to give a credit that, okay, he might have said to the patient, okay, take the sitagliptin and take the semaglutide. Uska logic ye hai that unfortunately semaglutide 3 milligram per day, it works like a sitagliptin 100 milligram per day. Therefore, the efficacy, what we need to again remind ourselves is, the actual efficacy of semaglutide comes at a 7 milligram. So what this particular slide plus particular information should generate the discussion is that once we start a semaglutide as on a 3 milligram per day, we must counsel the patient that, you know what, even if the sugars are high, we will probably readjust with some other therapies or with the dietary management, because it's going to take you at least a month of a time to have and obtain a great benefit from the context of a semaglutide. So a semaglutide 3 milligram per day with a sitagliptin of course is wrong. Coming over to the evidence, I'll quickly brush through it because evidences have been very elegantly taken by a lot of, in terms of various other lectures as well as my preceding talk as well. Quick question, semaglutide in terms of achieving the HbA1c targets, yes, across the PIONEER, so that is, again to remind, PIONEER is nothing but an acronym and the expanded format is a peptide innovation, right, trial. Why we talk about a peptide in innovation? Because this is the first peptide which is in terms of, as in first peptide hormone, which is in the oral formulation. And I'll also touch upon this aspect of as an oral formulation of peptide when we talk about injectable semaglutide. So PIONEER is nothing but a peptide innovation of an oral therapy and all those trials from PIONEER 1 to PIONEER 8. In terms of PIONEER 5, it was also done in a setting of an end-stage renal diseases also in terms of a lesser eGFR. Now, why do we say as about the potency of and ability of reducing the HbA1c? The first aspect, let's not think about a gut hormones only. When I use this word gut hormones, we understand we're talking about GLP-1 receptor agonist only as an obesity therapy. It's a wonderful anti-hyperglycemic efficacious therapy as well. With a baseline of an HbA1c of more than 9 across PIONEER trials, is for all of us to understand that the overall HbA1c reduction is to the tune of 2 to 2.5%. That's huge. That's huge because that's almost like what you can achieve with even insulin as well. In terms of the weight loss across the PIONEER trials, what happens? We are talking about 3 milligram, 7 milligram, or 14 milligram of semaglutide, oral semaglutide. The overall take is that almost 50% of the patients achieve more than 5% of weight loss. And if you are asked about that, how many patients actually achieved a weight loss of more than 10%, that's 20%. It's important in the context that any 5% of weight loss, it actually helps in all aspects of the metabolic syndrome, be it diabetes, the blood pressure, and the dyslipidemia. Once we are talking about a reversal or a kind of a reversibility of diabetes in terms of a no need of other medication as well, we are talking and asking about a kind of a weight loss to the tune of 15%. Somewhere at 10% becomes a trade-off. So overall, 20% would have a 10% of a weight loss, more than 10%. And by and large, in half of the patients, you would certainly achieve more than 5% of weight loss. That brings upon a discussion that when we use such kind of an oral therapy of the semaglutide, which costs us around 8,000 per month, if the weight benefit is not much, why should we even use it? The answer lies, think about the anti-hyperglycemic efficacy, because there are so many patients who are opting for the oral Rybelsus as well, because they simply don't want to go to insulin. It doesn't mean that insulin is bad. I mean, you just need to counsel our patients, but to talk about and remind about the anti-hyperglycemic efficacy. How does oral semaglutide really work from a weight context? It's everything to do with the appetite modulation. So there are two ways in which it works. One, most of the GLP-1, they would slightly delay the gastric emptying. So, but obviously, जो 2 रोटी पहले खाता था, even 1 roti, they will feel filled up. Now the same thing can be achieved if you ask patients that why don't you take the salads before the food. So that by that aspect also, they will not eat that roti or that extra chapati. But the extra benefit of GLP agonists, GLP-1 receptor agonists, is also to do with the brain. So there are GLP-1 receptors, and that's what the satiety. It's like not only they're getting filled up here, they don't have that craving. So two things are happening. One around the gut, and the second is around the brain. When we talk about the brain, That's also the reason as to why there is emesis. In terms of the nausea and vomiting, it's not just only to do with the delayed gastric emptying, but it's also to do with the kind of the GLP-1 receptors out there. Interesting, some of the GIP are being also evaluated right now as an anti-emetic therapy in terms of in the context of the cancer care and the chemotherapies. That leads on to a discussion that how the GLP-1 receptors in the brain, around the hypothalamus, of what are they really doing it. The overall aspect is nobody understands, I don't understand. But what we need to remind ourselves again is that since the MSS part, that is the nausea and vomiting, is more driven by the central, generally speaking, you may not have a great benefit with the classical, prokinetics like a domperidone. Quite often I've seen that it is a ondansetron which truly works in the setting of the nausea and vomiting with context with semaglutide. That also leads on to another statement which I keep on hearing. Alright, we have taken Ribosys, which is an oral. Let's take an injectable because the oral is going to irritate the gastric and probably the injectable would be better. Most of the patients who have shifted from the oral to the injectable still continue to have the same kind of an MSS, the nausea and vomiting which they had with the oral Ribosys. For the simple logic, because the MSS part is more centrally driven rather than truly gastrointestinal driven. Let's again come back from the central portion about how really does the oral semaglutide help the patient. It's about that food consumption and the overall energy intake. As you can see, the difference between semaglutide and the placebo is here to see for each one of us. The overall calorie intake typically goes down, and that is where the cascading effect related to reduced abdominal obesity, related to reduced weight, etc. A quick note on vascular inflammation, because Dr. Viveka was also talking about the inflammation part. In terms of CRP, as we can see, the CRP also goes down with semaglutide among type 2 diabetes patients, and an equal proportion of patients, if I talk about any other therapy which can match to the reduction of such kind of a CRP, is a hydroxychloroquine in the setting of diabetes, not even a metformin, not even a DPP-4 inhibitor. To provide the context out here, the anti-inflammatory aspect of the GLP-1 receptor agonist is now one of a very important proposition as to how it is helping in overall atherosclerotic cardiovascular diseases, as well as related to how semaglutide, now there is a trial which has now been shown that semaglutide, when being given, it is also helping in retarding further progression of the nephrovascular events. So we are talking about albuminuria, we are talking about a CKD. So everything in terms of the metabolic syndrome, the cardiovascular aspect, the atherosclerotic profiling, as well as the renovascular related aspects is being positively influenced by semaglutide. Brushing through it again on a quick note is the fact that what can we really achieve as a benefits out here. Number one, a potent HbA1c reduction with a gentleman who had an HbA1c of more than 8%. He might be into that half who would at least have a kind of a weight loss of more than 5% of weight loss. There would be a 20% reduction in the LDL cholesterol. Anyone who has a more than 5% of a weight loss than the baseline would also have, there's this dictum to recollect, this also would be having a reduction of a 5 millimeter of a systolic blood pressure reduction. Also, the rule of 5 which we were being taught once upon a time. And needless to state again and repeat it again, but it's important that it is probably the anti-inflammatory action of the GLP-1 which is possibly helping in a lot of aspects of the CKM and the cardiovascular related issues. Case number 2, on a quick note. So we talked about case number 1 where he just had presented with a history of angina. Here we are talking about an established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, had a myocardial infarction 5 years back. Here it is a metformin 1000 milligram twice daily, is tolerating. And I sometimes don't understand that why, from where it comes from, and this is the feedback to the no, at least in the entire company, is that why are some of the therapies missing which we ordinarily give, like let's say, even in this case, is a DPP-4 inhibitor. So if a person is not on a DPP-4 inhibitor, and of course with the conflict of the duality of interest as we are talking about semaglutide, if somebody is not on a DPP-4 inhibitor for any reason, would you quickly think about aspects like the GLP-1 receptor agonist? My answer would be a big no. Right? Ask why the patient was never on a DPP-4 inhibitor. Was it to do with anything like flaring of the gallstones? Anything to do with did he not tolerate a DPP-4 inhibitor? Whether there was DPP-4 inhibitors are also known rarely, very, very rarely, that can also lead to gastroparesis. So if they did not tolerate DPP-4 inhibitor, I think they would not even tolerate semaglutide or anything. History of pancreatitis. So that reminds again a case, a young gentleman who came to me around a few weeks back with a classical DPP-4 linagliptin induced pancreatitis and was given with the lure and the lalach, tera vajan ghatana hai, and was given a semaglutide in 48 hours, landed in a gastro unit with pancreatitis. So the point is that ask yourself a question, if a person was never on a DPP-4 inhibitor, why? Think about those questions, and just not the fact that we look around diabetes and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and go for quickly all those kind of good medication. So sometimes for all agents which have got such a great science behind it, such as semaglutide of course, one must also be aware where not to use it, apart from of course the utility of knowledge of where to use it. So okay, so it's come for a quick clinical review. BMI again high, blood pressure not controlled, HbA1c of 8.5%. Where do we need to look about the IFCC criteria of the HbA1c? Especially look about the IFCC criteria of HbA1c. More so in an individual where the hemoglobin is low, because there the HbA1c in terms of percentage may not get true reflection. Here the EGFR is 65, the SGPT is elevated. If you do a fixed scoring nowadays, that's a talk of the town by a lot of gastroenterologists in understanding about the risk towards the cirrhosis, etc. What are the considerations? Almost everything that we talked about. The gentleman who had a myocardial infarction with an obesity needs some therapy, and here, if the patient, if John is already on an SGLT2 inhibitors, one must think beyond and think about agents such as certainly a GLP-1 receptor agonist, what he can afford. What's the future risk? When we talk about a future risk that we talk about, and this is from the ESC guidelines, we talk about ACVD risk of less than 5% low risk, around 10% to less than 20% high risk, or more than 20% a very high risk. Any patient with diabetes, with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or a severe target organ damage are all in a very high risk category. When we talk about diabetes, we were once, the preliminary in terms of what are the complications of diabetes as an MBBS question, it's classically a microvascular complication and a macrovascular complication. So what is the common denominator? We say it is a vascular. So what is diabetes? It is nothing but a vascular related disease. So any vascular insult, be it in terms of retina or a retinopathy, plus a nephropathy, is to be categorized as a severe target organ damage. And if so, all type 2 diabetes mellitus, if they have got a nephropathy and a retinopathy, are to be treated as a very high risk criteria in terms of a further ACVD. So this 20% means this is a 10-year risk, right? So there's a 20% probability, more than 20% probability that a person would have again a kind of a coronary insult or a stroke. That's how we define a ACVD risk. In terms of how do we really manage it? Now here the gentleman already had a myocardial infarction, already on SGLT2 inhibitors, quickly brushing through it. So it's a type 2 diabetes mellitus with an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But obviously there are no other therapy apart from GLP-1 receptor agonist and an SGLT. So needs that you would have a we'll say these two therapies. How do we define that? How do we delineate which one to use first? Here the patient is already on SGLT2, but obviously certainly must think on whatever GLP-1 receptor agonist the patient can afford and think on those lines. So what changes was done? Again, oral semaglutide 3 mg once daily, and the protocol is like what? This 3 mg for 1 month. Please give it for 1 month. Must give it for 1 month. Otherwise, the patients will not tolerate it. Only in those rare individuals, and this is a little bit of I do a little bit of a trick. Apart from the prescribing information, if somebody is having a very high side of a glucose, and I know that 3 mg is not going to work so well in terms of an anti-hyperglycemic efficacy, and only to economize it, thoda sa jugaad ho jata hai from an Indian context, so it should not be recommended because every script comes in a 10 tablets. So I think that if a patient has tolerated for 20 days, in all likelihood also tolerate the next 10 tablets also. So why waste that 10 tablets? I sometimes economize on it. I say the 20 days ho gaya, absolutely no adverse event, we can go to 7 mg as well on a quick and fast note. Is there an evidence? There are a lot of evidence in terms of the semaglutide addressing the multiple severe risk factors. We talk about glucose reduction, we talk about body weight reduction of more than 5%. We talk about the systolic blood pressure reduction, the rule of 5, remember. In general, any more than 5% of body weight reduction will lead also to a systolic blood pressure reduction of less than 5. of more than 5. There's an LDL cholesterol reduction also, and of course there is no worsening or any increase of an eGFR, which is very important for each one of us to be reminded about the semaglutide. Is there cardiovascular benefit? That's another question that we would ask, because with SGLT2 inhibitors, there's so much of plethora of data related to heart failure, both in reduced ejection fraction as well as in preserved ejection fraction as well. In terms of an oral semaglutide, there's a cardiovascular safety data. That means it is not unsafe, it is safe enough to be used among patients. Among patients who actually had any atherosclerotic cardiovascular diseases as safe as placebo. And in terms of the SOUL trial, which also Dr. Viveka touched upon it, there's a cardiovascular benefit as well. In terms of the SOUL trial, which will be published, but there are certain top-line results as well, and that being that there is a 14% reduction in the risk of MACE, as Dr. Tulsiva stated, that we have approval in terms of an FDA, and we talked about it in terms of an FDA and the CKM syndrome. Well, the oral semaglutide and the SOUL trial, the injectable semaglutide already had a kind of a data with it, which showed a cardiovascular protection. But the oral semaglutide till now, of course the trial result will be getting published. These are all the top line results. It just brings upon a question that injectable semaglutide में तो बहुत अच्छे ये results है. Why not in an oral semaglutide? And why? And I'll just wind up out here rather than going into any other stuff. In terms of the oral semaglutide versus the injectable, just ask yourself a very simple question. Injectable semaglutide is given as 0.5 milligram per week or 1 milligram per week. Oral semaglutide in the top of the dose is a 14 milligram every day, and on a weekly basis it becomes like 14 into 7 is almost like 98 milligram. So you're giving an oral semaglutide that is Rybelsus of 98 milligram per week versus an injectable semaglutide of 1 milligram per week. It's all semaglutide. So where lies the difference? It's a very simple thing. It's a bioavailability. Well, that's right. There's a part of an absorption.
Only 1%.
The bioavailability is 1 to 2%. So what should it lead on to? The fact is, if you want to attain the benefit of semaglutide with your patients, related to both as a good anti-hyperglycemic efficacy as well as on the weight, you have to follow the ritual. The patient has to follow the rituals and make sure that the patient is absorbing it. Early morning, empty stomach, no tea, coffee, breakfast, no beverages for the next 45 minutes, and that's important. That's mandatory for patients who just cannot do that for whatever reasons. I said don't take semaglutide. It'll be futile. So it's a beautiful agent in terms of when we talk about overall risk reduction of further atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or a kind of a regression of even the atherosclerotic plaques. There are aspects related to great effect on non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which we are talking about now, metabolic associated steatohepatitis. There are great issues related to the weight. But the drug needs to be absorbed well, and so therefore it is our duty when we are writing such great agents to our patients, कि please इसको खाली पेट लेना है, make sure that you don't take anything else for the next 45 minutes to obtain great benefit related to this agent. On that note, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monashish, for a wonderful deliberation. We had a deal that you would leave by 9:45, but you have finished your lecture only by 9:45. You will give us 20 minutes, okay, for question answer. It's been a very purposeful kind of a talk, both by Dr. Viveka and Dr. Monashish. Please understand, when you start taking oral semaglutide, we always think sky is the limit.
लाइट जलाओ यार.
Okay,
पीछे की लाइट
take your height in centimeters and you say I am 175 centimeters, you are weighing 108 kilograms today, and I want to be 175 minus 100, Broca's formula 75 kilograms. It takes time. There is no magical cure. What is the message? The message is any weight loss is important. Even 5% weight loss is very significant. So please understand that do not wait for the skies. do not wait for the skies, and please understand that we need to be practical when we are taking oral semaglutide. There are a lot of competitors in the market. There is an injectable oral semaglutide which is going to be launched in India, which has already been launched in Europe and America and Australia. And there is now a molecule by Eli Lilly which is supposed to be more effective. But if you take oral semaglutide, it has a great advantage of being an oral medication. ठीक है, we Indians are, addicted to taking दवाई, मुंह से खानी है. Injection is a problem. Party or somewhere, you need to carry the injection, and you need to take the injection at the same time. So there are issues. Sir, my question are very few, but relevant to the talk. Now, with the ADA ESD guidelines in 2024 and 2023, if a medication which is supposed to be treating glycemia does not reduce weight, is not a good enough medication. Your comment on that?
All of us have moved ahead. The adage is that move ahead just from a glucose centricity management to manage everything, because the ultimate goal, as I touched upon, whole perspective is diabetes is nothing but a vascular disease, whether it is a microvascular or macrovascular. So we ought to even think about an agent which can modulate and modify a further risk progression related to all those events related to cardiovascular, the renovascular, be it a stroke, be it a kind of any microvascular. And under the same umbrella, there's an obesity related umbrella. So every agent just needs to be weighed in terms of the scale of benefit. Is it only able to reduce the glucose, or is it able to reduce the glucose plus do something else? So that is why most of the guidelines have been designed, that as you saw from all the guidelines. Any cardiovascular related issues, think about those two agents like GLP-1 receptor agonist and the SGLT2 inhibitor, because they have got the proof. Anything related to now, if you look about the guidelines that talk about even the liver related issues also, then we talk about the metformin, the SGLT2 inhibitors and the GLP-1 receptor agonists. And so most of the guidelines have moved ahead from what we call it as a glucose-centric management. And that reminds me about one of my mentor in my old drug discovery days, where he used to say many decades back that if there could be one agent which can reduce all the vascular complications, who would get worried on the glucose value. So that actually talks about so much of a depth of sense as to why we have moved ahead from just the glucose-centric management to picking up therapies which can have a benefit beyond just a diabetes care.
So you showed a slide just in the end of your talk which said that oral semaglutide reduces MACE by 14%. I am reminded of a famous trial called DECLARE on a molecule called dapagliflozin, and also on a very famous trial called CANVAS on a molecule called canagliflozin. The MACE reduction with CANVAS with canagliflozin actually was more than the MACE reduction with empagliflozin in EMPA-REG. But unfortunately, the cardiovascular outcomes were not that great either in DECLARE or in CANVAS. Actually in DECLARE there was no difference with the placebo. So the 14% MACE reduction, I want to ask you, was there actually any benefit on the cardiovascular outcomes?
Yes, so when we talk about the MACE, so we are talking about the last slide which was related to the SOUL trial. And that's about the oral semaglutide in the setting of atherosclerotic cardiovascular diseases. Because oral semaglutide did not have a trial. You had a sustained related trial which was a sustained sex to do with an injectable semaglutide. That had shown a cardiovascular superiority. And for the reason of which this trial was conducted, the oral semaglutide. Right? Oral semaglutide had initially had a cardiovascular non-inferiority, for the reason of which a SOUL trial was designed. Now the question that we are asking is that because it's all about a comparison about different sets of oranges, different set of different fruits, apples and oranges cannot be compared. Most of these therapies, whether it is SGLT2 or the GLP-1, be it oral, be it injectable, they are all event-driven trials. And so they will be not a kind of a designated like over a period of 7 years. So many events happen and you close the trials. So therefore, no trials could be compared. But having stated it, in terms of the sole trial of an oral semaglutide related to the MACE, that looks certainly different as compared to the SGLT2 inhibitors. Having stated it, even with therapies from liraglutide, the Victoza, that has been realized that the overall atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease progression is definitely retarded, and it has got a positive impact on the overall MACE outcomes. And when we talk about the MACE outcomes, we are talking about both the cardiovascular as well as the stroke. So one of the things which we need to see, this is just a top line result. Somewhere I have seen that most of the GLP-1 receptor agonists, they somewhere have a great benefit on one important aspect where SGLT2 inhibitors does not touch upon it, and that is stroke. Stroke. In terms of stroke, which is the proof of
Ischemic stroke, sir.
ischemic stroke, and especially related to stroke. When we talk about a stroke, it is talking about the big vessel atherosclerosis.
Atherosclerotic effects.
So when we talk about the atherosclerosis, GLP-1 receptor agonist as such, across the board, you talk about dulaglutide, you talk about even the semaglutide, that's where the reduction of stroke has happened. And we really need to understand what happens in the SOUL trial. Whenever it gets published, this is all a top line result. So that's the answer to your question.
Dr. Monasis, from my side, the last question, sir. I have been using Rybelsus. I have been a great fan of Rybelsus ever since it has been launched. I have nearly 50 to 60 patients on Rybelsus. The problem that I faced is, as you titrate from 3 milligram to 7 milligram to 14 milligram, there is a kind of a tachyphylaxis after 14 milligram, and after a few weeks or months, patients do not have any benefit of weight loss. Are there any additional benefits which are hidden apart from weight loss, which I must convince my patients and my friends who are on Rybelsus, no, continue taking it and do not only focus on the weight, because what they are doing is they are measuring the efficacy of the medication once they stand on the scale in the bathroom. Your comment on that?
So the way we mostly start on the Rybelsus, apart from the effect on the weight, is that we are using it for your diabetes care. So think about a patient who is on maybe a glimepiride of, let's say, 6 milligram or a gliclazide of 120 milligram, metformin full dose, SGLT2 inhibitors full dose. You add the GLP-1 receptor agonist, it really works as a kind of an anti-hyperglycemic efficacy. So our job is not just only as an obesity. So it's a clear-cut comparison for our patients that what do you want? You want to go into insulin? Nothing bad about insulin. It's one of the best therapy. Or do you want to use an oral semaglutide? And quite often I see that if the weight does not have a great benefit on a 14 milligram, I said that let's be reminded, half of the patients do have that kind of a weight loss benefit. 30% may have just a kind of a few inches loss. So it all depends on what are the benefits that we can show to our patients. And one of the benefits which we discuss as a part of our routine clinical care is we are using a diabetes therapy, a therapy which is not approved for weight loss, but you will have a benefit on the weight loss. So it's not a therapy which is approved for weight loss, by the way. Semaglutide, oral semaglutide doesn't have an on-label approval for weight loss. The weight loss approval is more for a VOV. The weight loss approval is for Mounjaro, where we are talking about a tirzepatide, where the BMI is more than 30. Not for just a standalone therapy for a weight. So back to your question, Chavan sir, is that how do I convince my patient? More than the conviction to the patient, it is more in terms of our own conviction as to why we are using it and for what benefit are we using for patients. Don't forget the aspect that it's a great diabetes medication in terms of a good glycemic efficacy. Thank you so much.
I have to ask a question. Our discussion has gone on Rybelsus versus Ozempic. Now, you have wrote that Ozempic has to be given in very high doses. Sorry, the Rybelsus, Ozempic has to be given in 0.25, 10.5 and slightly. Injectable I am talking. So I want to ask one question. Why injectable is not available even in India? Although if we see in Google, they say it is available. But it is also costing quite a lot. And I want the difference between the oral and the injectable therapy.
Any difference?
Right, so there is no difference because it's semaglutide at the end of the day. As I say that ultimately when we talk about injectable Ozempic versus an oral semaglutide, oral Ribelsus, there will never be in terms of a head-to-head comparison related to everything in terms of an efficacy. But however, just to help you understand, a 14 milligram of oral Ribelsus, which is semaglutide, that's oral semaglutide. Ultimately, we're talking about semaglutide. Oral semaglutide, Ribelsus, injectable semaglutide, Ozempic versus Wegovy. In terms of the level of semaglutide in the blood, the highest dose of that 14 milligram of oral Ribelsus, it matches between that 0.5 milligram to 1 milligram of the injectable Ozempic. So there are data related to the pharmacokinetics. In other words, what you are asking a question about it, sir, that is there any difference? I don't see a difference. And quite often I have a phrase where I tell my patients are always drops of Ozempic, and they are feeling that why to invest at around 18,000 or 20,000 rupees a month? And that still looks like cheaper, since we are talking about tirzepatide and Mounjaro, sir. It's like almost like $1,000 a month of the highest of the dose. I say that, you know what, the Ribelsus, oral Ribelsus is nothing but a poor man's Ozempic. So please, you can save a lot of dollars. Also, it's the same semaglutide. The efficacy I find it to be the same. I have patients who have been on oral, went to injectable, came back to oral. As long as the patient understands, it's not about me, as long as the patient understands, it's just a bit of a poor bioavailability. Take it properly, you absorb the dose, it has the same anti-hyperglycemic efficacy. Injectable, you're sure that the patient is injecting. So that's the answer again to your question. I don't perceive a difference in a 14 and 0.5.
Can I ask another question? I have to ask, in those patients who are already diabetes, if we have to start this drug, what will happen to the other drugs?
Would you be able to moderate the other medications, Ribepryde, SGLT2 inhibitors?
Yes, so if I'm starting with an HbA1c of let's say 9%, more than 9%, and the primary indication here being ultimately please take care of the glucose level, I would not like to change the medication to oral therapy. If the HbA1c is close to around 7% and if the primary indication is just about in terms of the weight aspect, there I would like to change some of the sulfonylurea dosing.
Dr. Saurabh Bansal has a question. He is a gastro oncosurgeon and he is also treating a lot of obesity patients in his clinic.
Sir, being a surgeon, I have a very straightforward question to you. I've been using Ribelsus. We have noticed a lot of patients get the gastroparesis. So my first question, so how do you deal with them?
So the best way to deal with any gastroparesis, and this we have realized it even from the days of Exentide, Biota and all those stuff, is to reduce the fatty concentration of the food. Number one, eat slowly, that's it. Nothing else. Nothing else.
No need of prokinetics?
No, it doesn't help so much. That's the kind of, just reduce the fat.
Right. So second question, with the modern current therapy of medical management of obesity with tirzepatide and semaglutide coming in picture in the last 3-4 years, where do you place anti-obesity surgeries, bariatric surgeries basically now?
Well, morbid obesity, if in terms of the weight loss did not happen over a period of 6 months to the tune of 0.5 kgs per week, and over a period of 6 months, I know that this will not work so great. So please refer to the kind of bariatric surgeons.
Dr. Ashok Chakravarti sir, a celebrated pediatrician, has a question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Sahu and Dr. Viveka, wonderful presentations. I have a question for both of you, probably who's going to answer.
For a long time,
We have been harping upon BMI as the indicator of problems. 25 is the normal, above 30 we take the adversity. Of late I read a paper in which they said abdominal circumference versus height is the parameter now. Is it true, number one?
So BMI is an indicator, it is a surrogate marker of actually a central adiposity. It's a surrogate marker. There are so many other aspects also where the BMI might be mislead, and you just have to, so think about think about a person who is very heavyweight but very tall in the BMI, we falsely put that into category of not obese but just an overweight. There the waist circumference certainly comes into picture.
Okay. So I think the circumference of the abdomen versus height is a better parameter indicator
I'm
as
not sure that again many of my colleagues are using it and which is better, we don't know. There's so many indices of anthropometric indices including our...
so we can use that as a prerogative.
Yes, it is one of the things. Waist hip ratio of course another thing.
And for ladies it's 85 and for men it's 90%, 90 centimeters. 0.5 is the cut of mark. Thank you so much, Dr. Saab.
Dr. Pradap sir, who is our celebrated minimal access surgeon. Also the recently elected Director, College of General Physicians at IMA headquarters. You don't have to
Party.
go your head in, you should be proud, man.
Yeah.
Come on,
Don't be president of DMA.
No,
come on, man.
Congratulations, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, ask your question.
I think Dr. Saurabh raised the issue of using semaglutide in patients who are undergoing bariatric surgery. It has to be given in those patients also. In morbid obesity patients, those who are not fit for bariatric surgery, we give it as agent to reduce the weight, then they may be fit for surgery. And even after surgery, sometimes we have to maintain the weight by. So semaglutide has no competition with bariatric surgery, both have to survive. And both are complementary to each other. And one issue you raised, whether we should write obesity in diagnosis or not, we should write. And we should emphasize obesity should be written in your diagnosis column, then only you will also give importance and patient will also give importance. So we should not shy away from writing obesity as a diagnosis.
I would, before I give it to Dr. Tulsi and Dr. M.L. Kalwasar for the last bit of the question answer session, there was a wonderful poem that we read in 8th class, and I am sure Lalit would remember it. It was in our Hindi literature. लाला जी तुम किस चक्की का खाते हो? इस डेढ़ छटाक के राशन में भी दो बढ़ाए जाते हो।
Very good.
आराम शब्द में तो राम छिपा, जो भव बंधन को खोता है। आराम शब्द का ज्ञाता तो विरला ही योगी होता है। It is my friends, the sedentary habit. आराम शब्द का ज्ञाता तो विरला ही योगी होता है। Get going, get on your feet, go for a morning walk. भाई जब खाना यहाँ पे स्वीडिश खा रहे होते हो, then you determine and tell yourself, guy, I am going to go for a walk tomorrow morning. ठीक है? सुनो जब भाभी जी मैडम कह रही होती है, अरे भैया बहुत हो गए, कितने गुलाब जामुन खाओगे, बेचारे बाकियों के लिए भी छोड़ दो, तो बोलो यार भाई कल सवेरे घूमने जाना ही जाना है, ठीक है? आराम शब्द का ज्ञाता तो विरला ही योगी होता है। भाई ऐसे मत करो प्लीज, लीव योर sedentary habits and you understand भैया डेट छटा के राशन में भी दोनों बढ़ा जाते हो। Sir, I have a small question, sir. There are many people who eat very little. They say कि डॉक्टर साहब मैं उनको कहते हैं मैं डॉक्टर साहब कुछ खाता ही नहीं।
So please, that's seriously more to now.
Okay. Dr. Manasi says I will talk to you regarding this tomorrow about the poem and he will recite me the entire poem. Dr. Tulsi sir.
Thank you. Who's that? Pioneer Plus trials, which support high doses of oral sema. Obese patients with no diabetes, 25 milligrams. T2 diabetic patients, uncontrolled obese patients with the Pioneer Plus trial. ADA published in Lancet recently. So, in cardiometabolic disorders, this is as good as 2.0.
Dose which is actually used.
No, sir. I was talking about the Versus 1 trial and the other trial which talks about 25 and 50 milligrams.
What about the step trials? The step trials, yeah.
Not step trials, sir.
So there are trials, okay. And even for that, by the way, in terms of the matter of liraglutide, they have gone up to 3 milligram also without the trials.
No, sir.